Hi guys, let's discuss the occult meaning of Lucifer and Satan. Now, biblically, there's all kinds of different debates and ideas about these two figures, and I say two because they aren't necessarily indicated as being one in the same entity, even in the Bible, although they are often used interchangeably. And I think it's very interesting that this confusion or a lot of these different ideas should be the case, particularly when we understand what are the signifiers of these energies in terms of our occult cosmology, when we look at the planets and the different kinds of principles of consciousness that these entities are referring to. And you'll see what I'm talking about as we unpack it. So Lucifer in the Bible is referred to the morning star. And what is the morning star? The morning star is Venus. Venus is the fifth ray planet, the lord of concrete knowledge and science, ruling perception. And so Venus can have a hard time in those signs that such as Scorpio and Aries, which can be impulsive or off the bat unable to discern and differentiate. So the evolving Venus, as we've looked at plenty of times elsewhere, is that evolution out of what she's typically understood through the astral lens as beauty and love and the conjunctio, the Aphrodite energy, and that desire to merge evolves into the aspiration for knowledge. That's Venus in its Taurian angle, why we see Venus and prominent Taurian placements often in the charts of scientists. And then through Libra, it's the wanting to know the truth and bringing the two opposites together, with the lower octave of that being the relational principle. I want you, the codependency, the projection game, once again, the astral expression of that. But Venus is the mental principle of perception. And in her highest developed state, most high developed state, it goes a step up from discerning intellect and reasoning and logic into the activation of that ajna center, where we have the holding of the light within the head. And we will so often see the depictions of saints and mystics and Jesus in various portraits of them, where they have the halo around the head, the illuminated mind. That is the true enlightenment, because we can have the mystical and Neptunian revelation of divinity as the love principle, God as the eternally loving Father, and all of this, much more of a Piscean motif and a heart-centered motif, versus the real seeing. And as we understand Venus through Taurus, that's really the light bringer there. Before the evolution of Taurus then is the penetrating of that light into substance. And this is where we get the theme of the dissipation of astral substance, as it would be embodied through the sign Scorpio, for instance. We die to that which isn't true, and then the light is left standing, and we bring that into being, which is why Taurus rules the world disciple, everyone working with the soul, because that's what we're trying to do, bring light into being. So back to Lucifer. Lucifer, the morning star, the brightest star in the sky, which is Venus, and this principle of illumination. We also see that with the Buddha, who was born, enlightened, and died in the sign Taurus. But it is speaking to this revelation of spiritual truth, the capital K knowing, the knowledge aspect, but in this case, the higher octave of just purely intellectual knowledge into spiritual intuition and true insight. So what about the Lucifer as the one who went against God or fell into incarnation? There's all kinds of different variations of the origin stories here. Lucifer, the fallen angel, in one of the, I believe it's Islamic, not I don't think theological Quran dogma Islam, but maybe an esoteric branch or some version of the story somewhere, forgive my lack of scholarly precision here, is they say that what actually happened in this story was that God created humanity, and he said, look, Lucifer, my number one angel, look at this creation I've made. Please bow down to them. Bow down to this beautiful creation. And Lucifer went, no, I only serve you. I only look to you. And then that was what caused God to cast him out. Now, what an interesting tale that gives it a different twist psychologically, with this idea of the true source of Lucifer being that of the pure divine one who is connected to God or looking up to God. Why is this interesting? Because we understand Venus is the fifth ray and is connected to the fifth kingdom of souls, which is that's what humanity is aspiring to and what we're trying to mediate with and connect to. And the soul itself is the mediating principle between personality matter, soul, and the monad as spirit. So the idea of Lucifer being that which is closer to God, right? And that which wants to eventually go back to God. So isn't that interesting to think about this different angle? It brings a different psychological dimension, and certainly we can see why we would have a variation of the story that is expressing like this when we understand it esoterically. Now, coming to this fallen aspect, when we start looking at Lucifer in his potentially demonic expression, or Satan, the Satanism, and of course the word Satan corresponds very strongly to Saturn. So then we bring in this think piece here of, is what's the difference between the devil, Lucifer, Saturn, Venus, all of this. But we would say that, particularly with the Christian mindset, the idea is that the Luciferianism or Satanism, they worship themselves and they go against God. But what is really going on there? Well, for the black magicians in the world and those who are corrupted by power and are able to utilize the mental principle in terms of being quite organized, this is an inversion of the mind. So it is a lesser octave, let's say, of the mental body. And yes, these people are astrally polarized as well and all of that, because they're moving through selfish desire and all of that. But they have the organization of that mental principle, which gives them that capacity to wield substance and to be strategic. It's very Saturnian, very Capricornian. And we know that Capricorn is a sign of duality insofar as that crystallization of materialism. India is the Capricornian personality. We see such an exaggerated example, brilliant example of the duality in India, where we've got this rich spiritual history that would be the height of the spiritual mountaintop, the initiated one. And of course, Jesus was symbolically born in December during the season of Capricorn, where that's where the initiate is born or comes into being upon the mountaintop. But then the inversion of that, of the crystallization of the dense forms of materialism. And that Saturnian manipulative quality is a much more of that Mephistopheles, is that the name of in Milton's Paradise Lost? Something like, oh, not Paradise Lost, damn it. Faust, that's the one, so forgive me. But he's the devil figure, the Mephisto guy, and it's much more of this Saturnian shadow Capricornian flavour. But the similarities between the Venus or the Saturn are both that they have this correspondence to the mental principle. And the head, and now we're getting into some of the psychological stuff too, the head, in terms of when we talk about the Jungian archetypes, this is all the father stuff here. The animus problems up here for the woman, the negative father or the father complex, the organizing principle of consciousness, or that which ends up understanding who am I really, what are my right values. That's a very Venusian theme here, the balancing, what's important, becoming discerning, and then the capacity to build and structurally organize one's life. This is all the realm of the organizing principle of consciousness, and this is where we get the leading masculine or the authority or the king and all of this. So when we have that in its shadow, we have this inverted ruling principle that is selfish or destructive and all of this. So this is where we get the self-worship or the shadow of the mental principle. And it's a big problem with the dogmatic Christian or religious mindset, because they fail to discern what these different qualities of consciousness are. They'll sort of say anything to do with the occult or metaphysics, it's all Satanism, demonology, black magic, without discerning, well, actually, if you were to really stop and think about it, the deeper underpinning of occultism is like it's speaking to the revelation of spiritual truth through the mind, and it's really about whether we are imbuing the mind with the substance of light and whether the mind is fundamentally surrendered to that of the superior being. Because the head is this place of such self-identification, the centralizing of consciousness, right? It's where we feel like we refer to my body, but the me is up here. So it's this really fundamental point of identity. which is why it's so crystallized, that's Saturn, and why it's so difficult to rewire that mind, the principle of concentration, having to develop that faculty and all of this. But this is where we get Saturn as that dweller on the threshold, the constructing of the limits that binds someone to materiality in all kinds of different ways. And when we think about Venus, if this is the principle of illumination, she is in detriment in Scorpio, and that can look like that principle of reason and the ability to see light is submerged in the Maya, or in the case of Aries, which is the other detriment sign, when Aries, as it's ruled by Mars, the lower aspect of that expression can be not enough reasoning about who am I and who are you, and then there can be the codependency or the, oh, I'm attracted to you, let's go. You know, this is the fusing, but it's a diminishment of the principle of truth. And of course, we also have the highest metaphysical meaning of this, the detrimental placements of the planets, where we would say that in terms of Lucifer being less than God and the spirit, in the case of Venus in Scorpio, Venus is in detriment because eventually in the last analysis, this is the most occult level here that we're talking about, the principle of the mind and of mental illumination in the end also bows to the spirit. And Scorpio is the sign of the death of the lower self. And that's why a Venus in Scorpio person, as we talked about in the Venus video, in its highest possible expression, will be someone who can communicate or teach or understand just what the process is of having to crucify the mind, or how to kill off the lower aspect of the mind. Because really anything to do with the realm of Scorpio is going to bring some element of death. And even though we have to cultivate the mind and learn to utilize the mind, there is also a very real and unavoidable process of mental crucifixion that has to happen. And it's one of the big challenges for people in the realm of esoterica, generally, because it is a more mental field, just by its nature, scholarly field. And so many people remain trapped in their mental identification without realizing it. They may think they have all kinds of knowledge and they know what they're talking about, but they're not necessarily penetrating their minds deeply enough to know how that is actually withholding the spirit. Even though they're accumulating all this knowledge, there's still an identity there that's not surrendered to the spirit. And Venus is exalted in Pisces, the sign of the spirit. So we say that once Pluto has killed off, that's the interesting connection there, because it's like in detriment in Scorpio, but it's exalted in Pisces, and they share the death aspect there, right? So they're sort of describing these different angles of this regenerative process. But Venus, once Pluto will cut away and kill off and crucify the illusions, Christ was crucified, of course, then there's a re-emerging or a merging of spirit with substance. Right, so that's the true function of Venus, and more generally the soul. Venus being fifth ray lord, fifth ray of kingdoms, is the kingdom of souls. And that's what the soul does. The soul, as we first imbue our substance with the soul, if the soul does that, eventually for the fourth degree initiate, the soul itself in the last analysis gets crucified. And that's the process that Jesus went through. And that's when you get to the point where you don't have to come back into incarnation. There's no longer it's a direct line now from monad to matter. So Lucifer is the light bringer, that is to say the soul brings the light of God. Lucifer carries the torch for God as Lucifer descends down into substance. But the inversion of Lucifer, when it starts to get a bit murky with the definition of Satan or the shadow of like the devil and all of this, is where we talk about consciousness or the personality being fully stuck in the realm that's of the crystallized mind, or where we're unable to break open from the mind or crucify the mind, so that the mind too is surrendered or becomes, taken over by the principle of light, because that is fundamentally a releasing. It's not an intellectual process. You don't walk that process through researching occultism or study or any of this. There's a point where the mind has to be crucified and be let go, and the energy centers of the head have to come online, and then there's a repatterning and a reconstructing, just as there is with the astral body. But this is really the occult source of this, when we're talking about Lucifer in general and Saturn and Satan in general. has a lot to do with this mental control and the problem of the mind, the overcoming of mental control, the releasing of the mind, and then the reorganizing of the mind. And this is Lucifer, the light bringer here. Of course, the devil is also associated, I almost consider it the two devils really, where you've got Mars and Saturn, the two great malefics in Orthodox astrology even, right? Where Mars is the first dealing with the astral, and that's where you get more of the shadow and the psychic energy. But as we evolve through that, where we start to get over most of the bulk of the astral material, then it's often meeting limitations in the mind. It's like, oh, I can't do that. Or if we have more subversive shadows, then the way in which that could be more of an offensive role and things like that. And of course, the books talk about how even when someone gets to the 3rd degree, there can be rare examples of when a person in that position will fall into the Black Lodge and things like this. And you go, how? It's just, you know, I only have a few inkling ideas about what's going on there for the moment, but it's a very strange thing. But yeah, there's something where the mind can be inverted too, and then like kind of stay in the crystallized realm of matter or something like that. So the two devils and Satan, there's kind of Mars and Saturn in that way, the two different lower octaves of those planets. And then Venus, the submergence of that mental principle, but then the development of that mental principle, and Venus being this planet of truth, and then kind of lining up with Jupiter, who's more traditionally a planet of truth and wisdom and understanding and all of these sorts of things. But Jupiter's much more of a synthesis and bringing about the consciousness, and it of course corresponds to the heart center. So we see through its esoteric rulership of Aquarius the love and the desire to serve humanity and bring about this great sense of spiritual purpose in the name of everyone together, right? So the Jupiter and Venus are almost two aspects of this love nature, where we've got love and reason being Venus at the higher level. So truthfully, Venus is a planet of truth in terms of knowing what one is, or discerning the situation. What is the nature of desire? Is my desire true? That's the first early phases of this developing or spiritualizing Venusian quality as it elevates from sensuous, desirous, merging in Taurus and relational merging in Libra into the desire to accumulate knowledge and true insight and to understand the law of karma. And there we have another relationship between Venus and Saturn through the sign Libra, because Saturn is both exalted in the sign Libra, the law of love and karma, and it is the hierarchical ruler there. So touching on all of these things, which we've spoken about many different times, but in the context of Satan and Lucifer, it's all about the story of this mental principle. And even with the fact that the mind in the last analysis gets crucified, we touched on that with Venus and Scorpio, and the esoteric meaning of that in Aries, by the way, is that, again, where the sun is exalted, we say that the spirit is exalted, and that is fully embodied through the sign Aries. And so in the last analysis, once again, the mind bends to that of the ultimate will, embodied in Aries in this case. So that's the higher octave of the deeper occult meaning of that. So I hope this was interesting in terms of bringing a different dimension of awareness, or a deeper dimension of awareness, to the Satan and Lucifer problem. Most of you will know that that Alice Bailey's legacy was through, she left the organisation behind Lucis Trust, which was originally Lucifer Trust, and of course that got her into a lot of trouble. So it's a very difficult word, because there's so much stigma around it, and there's so much confusion about these different aspects of the shadow and about evil, and the Marsian aspect of the demons and the astral plane versus the crystallization of control and materialism in Saturn versus Venus, and what that really means as the morning star. But we can really distill those energies out when we understand them through that occult lens, and can also see why they get blended, because the connection between Venus and Saturn in terms of how they are similar is that they both describe some aspect of the mental dimension of existence. Okay, so anyway, that was just a little bit of a shorter one today on the occult significance of Lucifer and a little bit of Satan as well. So I hope you enjoyed. See you in the next one.